For Craig Melvin, the stories never really ended when the camera stopped rolling. They followed him home, lingering quietly in the spaces between ordinary moments, settling into the silence of his car ride, and eventually taking a seat at the dinner table, where his wife, Lindsay Charniak, would notice the subtle shift in his eyes before he even said a word. It wasn't always like this, he would later reflect, because early in his career he believed in a kind of professional boundary, a clean separation between the world's pain and the comfort of home. But over time, as he reported on global conflicts, humanitarian crises, and the deeply personal stories of those caught in the crossfire, that boundary began to erode, replaced by something heavier and far more human, the quiet understanding that witnessing suffering carries a cost that cannot simply be turned off like a studio light. One evening, after covering a particularly harrowing segment about families displaced by war, Craig returned home later than usual, the house dimly lit and calm, the familiar scent of dinner still lingering in the air. And as he sat down across from Lindsay, he found himself unusually quiet, his fork resting untouched as his mind replayed images he couldn't quite shake. And Lindsay, who had spent years in journalism herself and understood the unspoken weight of such days, didn't rush to fill the silence, but instead offered a gentle presence, a steady kind of listening that invited him, when he was ready, to share. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a softness that surprised even him, as he described not just the facts of the story, but the faces, the voices, the small human details that had stayed with him, the way a mother had held her child a little tighter, the way a father had struggled to find words to explain loss. And as he spoke, he realized that what he was bringing home wasn't just information, but emotion, the kind that settles deep and asks to be acknowledged. Lindsay reached across the table, her hand resting lightly on his, a simple gesture that grounded him in the present. And in that moment, Craig understood something he hadn't fully grasped before, that sharing these experiences wasn't a burden to be avoided, but a bridge that allowed him to process what he had witnessed, to transform it from something isolating into something shared. Yet even with that understanding, the emotional cost remained, revealing itself in unexpected ways, in restless nights where fragments of stories resurfaced, in quiet moments when laughter felt just a little harder to reach, and in the subtle tension between wanting to protect his family from the world's harshest realities and needing to be honest about what those realities meant to him. Over the years, Craig and Lindsay developed a kind of rhythm, an unspoken agreement that some nights would call for conversation, while others would call for quiet companionship, where sitting side by side without words became its own form of healing, a reminder that not every feeling needs to be explained to be understood. For Craig, this balance became essential, not just for his well-being, but for the integrity of his work, because he came to believe that the empathy required to tell meaningful stories must be nurtured, not suppressed, and that allowing himself to feel deeply, even when it was uncomfortable, was part of what enabled him to connect with others in a genuine way. For Lindsay, supporting him meant recognizing when to listen, when to speak, and when to simply be present, drawing on her own experiences to create a space where Craig could set down the emotional weight he carried, if only for a little while. Together, they found strength in the ordinary rituals of life, shared meals, quiet evenings, the steady rhythm of days that provided a counterbalance to the intensity of Craig's work. And it was within these moments that the true resilience of their partnership revealed itself, not in grand gestures, but in the consistent, compassionate ways they showed up for one another. As the years passed, Craig began to speak more openly about the emotional cost of his profession, not as a complaint, but as an acknowledgement of the reality that comes with bearing witness to the world's most difficult truths. And in doing so, he offered something valuable to those who had spent their own lives navigating the complexities of work, family, and personal reflection. A reminder that it is not weakness to be affected by what we see and experience, but rather a sign of our shared humanity. For those in their later years who have lived through decades of change and challenge, Craig's story resonates as a quiet affirmation that the emotions we carry, no matter how heavy, can find a place of rest when shared with someone who understands, and that the dinner table, often seen as a place of routine, can also become a space of connection and healing, where the outside world is not shut out, but gently integrated into the fabric of our lives.
And so, night after night, as Craig Melvin returns home and takes his seat across from Lindsay Charniak, he does so with the knowledge that while he may bring the world's stories with him, he does not have to carry them alone, because in the steady presence of someone who listens, the weight becomes lighter, the silence more meaningful, and the act of sharing, however imperfect, becomes its own quiet form of grace.